Hello everyone, my name is Etsuko. I come from Japan. My background is as a social worker. I obtained my Master of Social Work degree from the University of Hawaii and my doctorate in social work from the University of Auckland, New Zealand. I used to work as a social worker and caregiver in Japan and the United States. I wanted to make a society that is accessible, where there is no problem of giving birth to and raising children with disabilities. Actually, issues involving the sexuality of people with disabilities sometimes came up from my colleagues during social work cases, and often even the social worker was not sure what to do. Therefore, I wanted to know more about this topic. I was also a family member of someone with a disabilities. By experiencing these different relationships with people with disabilities, I come to realize it is very important to understand not only the voices of people with disabilities, but also the voices of the people who surround them and who support their needs. This is the overview of the presentation. This is my cousin, by the way. He had a progressive muscular dystrophy and passed away 8 years ago. First, let me take you to my research site, Japan. How many of you know the unique sexuality culture in Japan? You see the penis statues? Those are at the festival in the shrine. There are many shrines like this across the nation in Japan, in which the principal object of worship is penis or vagina, and people pray for easy delivery and to be blessed with children. Buddhism, Confucianism, and Shinto are considered the three major religions in Japan. Those three religions have been blended completely so that Japanese people practice all of them as an integrated whole, without being conscious of any contradictions. Although the perspective of sexuality has been shaped by historical change, there are still many pressures, especially for women, regarding marriage and childbirth. However, discussing sexuality issues in public is still considered taboo. For those reasons, it could be said that in Japan, talking about sexuality is a double standard. How is disabilities considered in Japan? It has also changed according to historical changes. In some eras, people with disabilities were considered as gods to bring happiness, but in other eras, they were treated like an exhibition. Basically, a person with disabilities has to be a virtuous person and always be seen as striving hard to overcome difficulty. In 2004, a book titled Sex Volunteer became a bestseller in Japan. After that, many activists began writing about their experiences of sexuality and disabilities in an autobiographical format. Along with ratifying the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2014, Japan started in 2016 to enforce domestic legislation in the form of the Act of Elimination of Discrimination Against Persons with Disabilities. However, it is not clear what kind of situations would be considered cases of discrimination in relation to issues of sexuality and disabilities according to this legislation. Unfortunately, Japan has a history of sterilizing people with disabilities. This situation dramatically changed in 2018 when people with disabilities who were sterilized successfully sued the Japanese government, and the movement has spread across the nation. However, so far the demands for compensation have been rejected due to the statute of limitations, which is 20 years after the forced surgeries. Although Japan's cultural values hold a double standard when talking about sexuality issues, and not only people with disabilities, but also their households are stigmatized, the findings of research conducted by the Japan National Assembly of Disabled People's International Women's Network in 2012 that more than 30% of females with disabilities have been sexually abused or harassed in Japan, mean that it is time to explore what is going on. My research was intended to help the government or other policy makers collect and provide information to make a revision on domestic legislation. Additionally, approximately 90% of research on sexuality and disabilities is conducted in Western countries, so another contribution of mine was to add knowledge from a non-Western perspective. My research question was, how do people with physical disabilities experience sexuality in contemporary Japan? This involved related questions such as, what kind of needs do people with physical disabilities have in regards to sexuality, and how are those needs supported or restricted by their care environment? How are those sexuality experiences shaped by gender and type of disabilities? Lastly, what are the ethical dilemmas experienced by the people who are in a position of taking care of people with physical disabilities in regards to sexuality? I employed feminist disability theory, which interprets disabilities as human variation and aim for reimagining women and disabilities. Along with Japanese cultural framework defamiliarization, which criticized the idea of paternalism, which involves the quality of offspring. For my methodology, I used bricolage and critical feminist inquiry. Group 1. Research activities with people with physical disabilities. In this group, I obtained 27 participants, including 11 men, 14 women, and 2 transgendered, 1 questioning person. Group 2. Research activities with the individuals nominated by Group 1 participants for me to interview. These are people that the participants with disabilities felt were supporting their needs in some way. I obtained 3 participants, each with a different relationship to the person with physical disabilities who nominated them. Group 3. Research activities with family carers or health and social welfare professionals. I obtained 53 usable responses from this group. I offered multiple methods in order to make the research accessible. Physical disability has many different forms, so that for some of participants, an interview did not work well. The full project touched on many aspects of the sexuality experiences of people with disabilities. However, in this presentation, I will focus on the choices of interaction method made by people with physical disabilities when they talked about sensitive issues like sexuality, and whether the online method contributed to my research project. First of all, one of the major findings was that many participants preferred to meet in person, evidenced by the fact that 16 out of 17 participants who preferred to be interviewed chose to do so face-to-face. When I started this project, Zoom was not popular yet, so in most of my presentation, I used the word Skype instead of Zoom, as do most of the participants I quote. Even the participant who chose Skype initially preferred to meet in person if there was no mismatch in the interview schedule. It turned out that unless the participant was busy, or the distance was too far, or there was an accessibility issue, more participants could have chosen the face-to-face interview. My intention was trying to make this research accessible to people with any kind of disabilities, so my initial assumption was that people who have relatively severe physical disabilities might choose the Skype option due to the inconvenience of leaving their home. However, it turned out that even those participants with relatively severe disabilities preferred to meet me in person, and some of them have asked me to visit their home. In the end, since I received so many requests to meet in person that, due to limited funding, I eventually had to limit my research advertisement to participants in the Tokyo area. First, participants seemed to consider meeting face-to-face to be a way to build trust. As for building trust in order to protect research subjects when conducting research on a sensitive topic, employing an anonymous survey is recommended over face-to-face interviews by many institutional review boards. The situation was opposite for my participants. It's easier to talk in person. I can visibly see what kind of person is doing the research, and even a visually impaired person can sense what kind of person is doing the research by feeling her or his energy. I prefer to meet and talk to a researcher in person. Otherwise, I have to participate in a research without knowing what kind of person the researcher is. And if it's just exchanging emails, the researcher can lie about his or her personality. Rather, my participants wanted to know who I am and felt that they were able to check my personality and trustworthiness by meeting me in person. One of my participants even advised me that whether I would be able to obtain sensitive stories from participants depends on whether I'm trusted enough by the participants. Second, this phenomenon might have to do with the Japanese high-context culture, which values face-to-face interaction rather than employing electronic technology. I like to talk by looking at people's faces. From my experience, I know how writing can imperfectly express people's feelings. It's better to meet somebody, because then you should be able to understand their feelings through their facial expressions, pressing, distance, and other information. But when you put it into words, you can only convey it through the information in the text, and I feel that is inadequate. In high-context cultures, people try to understand what is not literally said through body language and in silences and pauses, so that face-to-face meetings would help in understanding those indirect meanings. Furthermore, it is said that for sensitive topics, email would gather more accurate, rich data than face-to-face interviews. And again, the case with my participants was the opposite. I had several participants who had a speech disorder due to paralysis. They told me that due to the paralysis, it was also hard to write a long email for them so that it was easier for them to communicate with me face to face. It has been discussed elsewhere that the advantage of employing Skype is that it would make it possible for participants to stay in their own chosen environment. And so I was expecting that Skype would be applicable for people with disabilities who want to participate in an interview even though physical relocation is hard. I am not good at Skype, and it is troublesome to explain by writing. I think your reactions are so important. When talking about sexuality experiences, there is a moment to think, did I do the right things? I feel confirmed and empowered by your reaction. I think it's important to have direct contact with people rather than a screen-based relationship which feels disconnected. In this way, I can more openly express myself. In this sense, meeting directly is so important. Many participants told me about the difficulty of using Skype, an embarrassing feeling when communicating via a screen, and the loss of connectedness with the researcher. Also, when considering Japan as a high-context culture, since the researcher and participants are not able to share the same atmosphere by employing Skype. My conclusions are, online space was not enough to let my participants sense the energy and understand the personality of the researcher when discussing intimate topics. Understanding those qualities would greatly contribute to the data collection. Online space seems to cause a sense of disconnection between participants and the researcher. Email exchange was not a good option for people with physical disabilities if they have some difficulty in typing. Also, my participants thought that the written word sometimes does not carry the emotion and is inadequate for expressing themselves. What is ethical would depend on context, but in my experience, the researcher needs to be ready to meet in person with participants and show her or his personality. I presented in another paper that I used a karaoke box to conduct a private interview in a publicly accessible space. In this sense, researchers need to be creative about how and where intimate topic interviews can take place. Thank you so much.